Gently called Ramses the Pigeon. Thanks, Ramses. We're probably recording at this point. I have a new game. Nicaea. I am very excited to play with some of you when we get our game group together or have another game night at the church when it's safe again to do so. Very excited about that. And it reminded me of a time a few decades ago when I was babysitting for this family. I had babysat for them before. I did it frequently where families were friends. And this particular time, at least one of the children came in talking about how they learned that Jesus went to hell for 3 days. I laughed in their face, told them that was a ridiculous concept. Where had they gotten that dumb idea? Evidently, in my family's inconsistent church attendance, I hadn't been exposed to the Apostles' Creed quite yet, and I hadn't heard the part about he suffered under Pontius Pilate, was crucified, dead, and buried. He descended into hell. On the 3rd day, he rose again. These days, it's more often recited he descended to the dead, and to their credit, that's the way the Methodists always did it. Many of us have at least attended a church where the Apostles' Creed was recited every Sunday morning. How many of you have recited it at least once in your life? Almost all of us. How many ever said the descended into hell part? A few of us. I don't really believe much of that creedal statement anymore, but I do give the authors credit. That brief statement pretty much outlines everything they believe. If you want to teach children, if you want to explain your faith to strangers, if you want to enforce conformity throughout your community, that short statement makes it pretty easy to do. Of course, it wasn't always that short. It was written by bishops, and you know how religious leaders like to go on, present company accepted. It was about half again as long when the bishops at the Council of Nicaea finished up their set of statements. And then they made some major changes to that one about a half a century later at the Council of Constantinople, and they kept tinkering and editing for another century or so before they got it to where it was pretty much what we know today. That statement of faith is exactly what the Roman emperor wanted when he called all 1,800 Christian bishops together in Nicaea in the year 325 of our common era. Emperor Constantine had converted to Christianity, and that was working out pretty well for him and for the church. But some of the folks kept arguing. Constantine was not a theologian. He did not particularly care what answers the bishops came up with, as long as there were answers, which would keep his empire and his state religion from fraying apart. So Constantine called the First Council of Nicaea and told the bishops to hammer out some kind of agreement. It was there, according to some stories, that St. Nicholas punched Arius. It was definitely there that Christianity became officially Trinitarian. In fact, they didn't even have the word Unitarian until much, much longer. The closest thing they had at that point was anti-Trinitarian, which was often used as a slur and eventually sometimes a death sentence. Back to St. Nicholas and the Council of Nicaea, we don't really know that he was actually there. His name is on some lists of attendees, but he's never mentioned in any of the writings by the people we know to have been at the council. And there are a whole bunch of lists of people who were there. Some of them say there are about 200. Some of them have well over 300 names. St. Nicholas of Myra is on some of those lists, but only on the really long ones. suggesting his name may have been put there later by some of his followers and adherents. Sometime in the 14th century, like a millennium after the actual council, we find a story about how Nicholas was at the council and slapped, quote, a certain Arian, unquote, across the face. Notice it was originally a slap, which is still violence and still to be avoided. Like the saw in the video text, that slap isn't necessarily fun, but maybe a slap is less awful than a punch. Over time, though, the slap became called a punch, and a certain Arian became Arius himself because they were printing the legend, not the history. Now, supposedly, why did he slap? Why did Nicholas slap Arius, if he indeed he did? There was vigorous debate about several issues at this council. One of them was the date of Easter. Would they follow the eastern half of Christianity or the western half? And really that question was, will we remain in sync with the Jews or will we determine it independently? And a lot of it was about the nature of Jesus with respect to the Father. Was Jesus subordinate to or co-equal with God? Was he created or co-eternal? And everyone's favorite, homoousian or homoousian? Homoousian. See, I knew I was going to get that wrong. So I have these cool cards in here with those words on them. And when I was planning all this, I would hold them up to the camera on my computer, and you could all see this big long word and how similar it was. And now we got a camera way over there, and this prop isn't as cool as it once was. But homoousian and homoousian were a big battle between the people in Nicaea. And homoousian is of one substance, homoousian is of similar substance. In other words, was Jesus as divine as God? Was he also human or only human or some mixture of divine and human? And if so, exactly how much of which kind? Arius insisted that Jesus was divine, but not quite as divine as God the Father. And Jesus was not co-eternal with God, but being his son was created by God a little later. I guess in 325, them's fighting words. Nowadays, the party line is that Jesus and God and the Holy Spirit are co-equal, co-eternal, consubstantial, three different beings in one, all together, none of them better than the others, a holy trinity. And that has been the accepted and enforced dogma since the Council of Nicaea. Now, some will say the council reached the right decision because they were all being guided and inspired by God. So, of course, any decision they reached would be the right, accurate, truthful one. Others will insist that human personalities muddied the process, that bribes and blackmail and even an occasional slap or punch were involved in writing down the things that billions of people would still be reciting 16 centuries later. Similarly, some people are unhappy with this game because it treats the Council of Nicaea as a political concept, and they trade power back and forth rather than being completely divine inspiration. I think the people who say these things worry that if we learn too much about the human meddling, we might discount or lose sight of the ideals that initially inspired them. And they're not totally wrong. Before I went to seminary, I was visiting some friends at Christian Theological Seminary, and they called it Christian Theological Cemetery, where faith goes to die. In the modern saying, you don't want to watch sausage or politics or theology made. In the language of our first reading from Byrd, the legend is much more satisfying. The history, the facts may not sustain us the way the legend might. So how do we reconcile the purity of our best intentions with the unequal and unjust systems that are our species' historical impact? I will let the game designer weigh in. Amabel Holland tweeted about this recently, and she tweeted, "Most days I still call myself a Christian in a Nicene tradition, and I hold those beliefs deeply. But had the debates gone a different way, it'd be a different tradition, and I'd believe it just as deeply. How do you square that? I'm a lesbian in a faith that is often deeply homophobic and patriarchal. I'm a trans woman in a world that uses that faith to push for my dehumanization. How do you square that? One of my earlier games, the vote, suffrage, and suppression in America, is more explicit, as it is about the triumph of the women's suffrage movement, while recognizing that it only secured voting rights for white women and intentionally left others behind. It's a gross injustice, but part and parcel of liberal feminism, which centers the concerns of white middle-class cis-het women and treats those concerns as universal and pursues reform within the patriarchy and white supremacy rather than pushing for its needed abolition. At the same time, is it better to accept half measures and keep fighting, keep pushing, or to refuse them and demand progress that isn't yet feasible? I suspect that your answer might depend on whether or not you benefited from those half measures. I can be angry about historical injustice while understanding why it went down the way it did. I can advocate for justice and progress rather than incremental reform while understanding the cold realities of the political system. I can believe the divine mysteries at the center of the Nicene Creed while understanding that it, like the Bible, was written, edited, and interpreted by men to secure institutional power, and that it only comes to us today because of that institution's continued power. Just as I believe in the rule of law while recognizing that laws do not actually exist, this isn't cognitive dissonance, it's an essential part of being human." End tweets. In the language I've heard Mark Bellatini use, borrowed from the Jewish tradition, the Nicene Creed is true in the way in which it is true. My psychotherapist says it's a sign of maturity to be able to tolerate ambiguity. I think it takes spiritual maturity to handle ambiguity and paradox in our religious traditions, myths, and origin stories. What does all this mean? I think it means that Larry McMurtry was wrong. We need both legend and history. The legend reminds us of our ideals. History reminds us of the work remaining to be done. The legend continues to drive us forward. The facts give us a map to guide our next steps. The first ecumenical council at Nicaea was not the undiluted translation of God's perfection into human history, and it was much more than just a bunch of backstabbing bishops scrabbling for power. Each of us has a little bit of both in us. We are, like Nicholas of Myra, both the person who wants to slap somebody and the part that wants to throw gold through somebody's window and help them. Maybe if we use less energy demonizing the slapper in ourselves and in others, we will have more energy to live out the part that wants to help people. So may we be.